Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our last First Nation Speaker Series for the year, which is great, and it's great to have a very distinguished guest here. But before I get too far into it, I'd just like, for those of you who don't know me, some of you have heard me be up here before, but I'm Peter White. First and foremost, I'm a Gomeroi Murri from northwest New South Wales, a little place called Manila, not Philippines, but outside of Tamworth, and come from a strong cultural connection in a place called Bora Crossing. The other hat that I like to do is I'm also the head of First Nations Cultural Engagement. But being a Gomeroi Murri who has the honour and pleasure and the obligation of living and working on Gadigal country, I would like to take this time to acknowledge Gadigal people, Gadigal ancestors, and future generations of Gadigal people who lands that we have the honour to live and work on and be here today at this very special place, very significant place, as not really the Museum of Sydney, but the site of First Government House, which was that seat of power to those people who arrived and never sort of went away. And I guess that's what this First Nation Speaker Series is about, the importance and the time that we're currently in, the changing times, the need to step up and listen to Aboriginal people and First Nations people to understand not only our perspectives and the history that we share, but also those histories that have been forgotten, not by us, but other people. And I think that's one of the real important elements of doing things like the Speaker Series here at First Government House, but also to, we hear a lot about truth-telling, but do we really understand? And I think going right back to that first time that, as I said, those unintended visitors, I guess you could call it, first set foot just down the road there and made camp and built this, started building and this place of power and direction that had so much impact, both on how Aboriginal people were viewed in the colony, but also the land tenure that changed and the dispossession, but also that start and the original intent of, creating good working relationships. We hear and question why there wasn't a treaty. And I'm assuming, I can only think of the Gadigal people who still are here and are still, drawing on those long, continuous cultural connections to this country, what they think of those efforts or lack of to build good cultural relations. And I think I'll open up now to, quickly introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Nareen Young, who's the Associate Dean of now the Indigenous Leadership and Engagement and Business School at the Business School at UTS, and to share her work. And we are very privileged. Nareen is, of course, a nationally and probably internationally recognised leader within the diversity and workforce. And really the project that we're going to hear about stems right back to that building good relationships. So it's not one thing to just have Aboriginal people and First Nations working with you, but how do you actually really understand and work with them, not at them? So I'd like to welcome Nareen to the whatever this is, lectern, podium, and really look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Oh, that's a bit dodgy. Thanks, brother. And I would, first of all, like to introduce myself, as is our way. My name's Nareen Young. In Aboriginal way, I am a descendant of the Gadigal through our great-grandmother, who, along with her 3 siblings, one we've only recently found out about and the others we only found out about 15 years ago, were resettled and then removed, and our family dispersed out into the Sydney suburbs. And so I grew up on Dharawal, very, very grateful to have grown up on Dharawal, but I am a descendant of the Gadigal, of the Fowler family, and I'd like to acknowledge Wujiri Kamaru in my language that I had never heard till very recently, is hello. In the Sydney language, thanks to the work of our Tita Jacqueline Troy that we know. And I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal ancestors who walk with us, the elders past and present. This is, to me, a bit of a difficult place. I always feel a bit both at home and familiar down here on the harbour, but also around these places that we don't know everything that happened here, and we will never know everything that happened here. And I think the generosity of mob is epitomised by the sharing of where the tank stream was, that Macquarie Street and here was always a place that people used as to walk up and down. It wasn't a new thing that the colonisers suddenly discovered Macquarie Street was a good place to be. Macquarie Street was here. It wasn't called Macquarie Street, obviously, but this is a place where I feel a bit unnerved always when I'm around, and particularly here at this place, but unnerved good ways, because it reminds us who we are and who we're descended from and what we are. I'd like to acknowledge my children here, also descendants of the Gadigal, Harry and Roisin, their partners, my partner Paul Murphy, and we're all here tonight as a family. And I have to mention this, it's totally irrelevant, but one of our dear, dear, dear friends I've known since I was about 21 or 22 years old, thanks to voluntary assisted dying, left us or is leaving us as we speak. So it's I'd like to acknowledge you, Jeffrey Fisher, your decency and kindness and your role in our family over a very long period of time, who you are, a settler colonial who always displayed such great respect for our people and the land that we live on. So I'm sorry I had to do that, but for our family here, it's why we're all here together tonight, and it really had to be done. So thank you for indulging me. My background is many, many years as an employment practitioner. I worked in the mainstream. I started out as a trade union official. I started out at Teachers College, as many women from my class and race background. When we said to our fathers, it was kind of worked out that we were smart enough to pursue a tertiary education, our families, because we have to rely on our earnings in our families. My father said, "Well, if you're not doing a BA, what does that mean? What does that qualify you for? You're going to go to you be a teacher." I did teaching, and my sister did nursing. We had to get a trade. So I did teaching, and I ended up working for my union, which was the Independent Education Union, and I started as a trade union official, and I did that for 8 years. And then I became director of the New South Wales Working Women's Centre, which we now call Diversity Employment, but then we called Women's Employment. So I was incredibly lucky to have that job and learn how to work at the intersection of human rights and employment legislative frameworks. And that then became diversity. Women's employment then became diversity employment, and I was the Chief Executive of Diversity Council Australia for 7 years, where I built up diversity practice in this country and how we understand it and how we approach it. In a team, I always work in a collective because that's the kind of chick I am, really, and that's what works for me. With the amazing team that we formed at DCA. When I started there, it had 70 members. It now has about 1,200. So I'm very, very proud of what we created with that team there of a board and staff, many of whom are still there, and the impact that Diversity Council Australia has had on diversity employment, which is important in the context I'll talk to you about in a minute. I then worked at I left DCA. I worked with Tone over here at Westpac as a consultant for about 6 months. And it's great to see you here, Tony Fitters, and who has always been such a diversity employment supporter. And then I worked at one of the large consulting firms in the Indigenous consulting arm. It starts with P, and we don't really talk about it anymore. But it has a large consulting, a large Indigenous consulting arm, which is independent, which was always independent, and remains independent of that large firm. And then I got to work exclusively around mob and work. So I had worked around Indigenous people and work for many, many years, starting with the Working Women's Centre. But then in those years at that large consultancy, I got to work exclusively around Indigenous people and work. We said then, it's New South Wales, of course, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but I work in my current job in the national context, so Indigenous or rapidly becoming First Nations is utilised a lot. So then I was approached by distinguished Professor Larissa Berendt, who's a legend, and she said, would you like to come to Jumbunna, to the Jumbunna Institute of Indigenous People and of Indigenous Education and Research at UTS, which has really led the way in some of the things Pete alluded to earlier. Jumbunna has really, I always hesitate to use pioneering in the Aboriginal context, but pioneered the utilisation, the makeup of Indigenous-led and Indigenous methodologies in research. And what I was attracted to doing that job for was when we put together DCA in its current iteration, what I really thought was important that we do industry-based employment research in the Australian context. But why I was so attracted to the job at Jumbunna when Larissa took me out for lunch, as people do, and said, did I want to come to Jumbunna? I was like, yeah, was the opportunity to do Indigenous-led employment work. Why did I want to do that? Because, as Peter said, the relationship is such that all kinds of people make all kinds of pronouncements about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and work. At that particular time, Nigel Scullion was talking about it a lot, but nobody had ever asked our mob what we might think about the employment experience. So there's always talk about, let's be honest about it, how it's framed. It's racist. It's about they don't want to work, bludgeoning blacks, they need handouts, they only want to work in community employment schemes. I don't know how much the average Australian, and I think one of the things we learnt during that period in the lead up to the referendum was just how much ordinary people don't know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and why we need to talk about truth-telling, why we need to truth-tell, why in the employment context, for example, we need to have special measures applied, why we need targeted positions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You probably don't know that we were actively excluded from the labour and employment markets until very, very recently in the history of this colony. We were actively excluded in New South Wales, and it's the only place I can speak about with authority, from the education system. We were in our yarn earlier, we were talking about the State Archives. I've been there, and it's a very confronting place. And one of the things that Professor Kirsten Thorpe, who's one of my colleagues at Jumbunna, had brought out was archival records of her own community. She's a Warramah woman from Port Stephens, and there was until the mid-1970s, for Aboriginal children to be expelled from a school, it only took a complaint from one parent. So only one white parent, non-Aboriginal, settler colonial, whatever you want to call yourselves, only one white parent had to say, and they didn't have to give a reason. They just had to say, I don't want my children in a school with Aboriginal children, and the Aboriginal children got expelled. So you will know maybe that on the missions and reserves that our people were put on to after our land was taken off us, and we were taken off that land, and we were taken to missions and reserves to live and provided rations to eat, that we had schools that were mission and reserve schools, and that's where our children usually got their education. But if people were living in a mainstream community and their children went to school, and one parent didn't like blackfellas, and said to the principal, I want them to be expelled, the principal would. I saw this exchange of letters between the Education Director General and a principal who was objecting to the Aboriginal children. What a brave, we'd now say, ally this gentleman was, who said, no, I'm not expelling them. No, not doing it. And then the letter went back, and he said, and what was the reason that the parents gave? That the Aboriginal children are dirty. Well, I can say with authority that all of the children in this school are dirty, and you're not asking for the white children to be expelled, so I'm not expelling any. And I thought, geez, what a legend, right? So, you know, when people object to special measures around education, around tertiary education, around employment, these are the make-up things that we have to do, right? That we're now in a position where we had to do. It wasn't until 1966 when the decision of the then Arbitration and Conciliation Commission, the ACT, the Northern Australian Workers Union, made application to the Federal Arbitration Commission for there to be equal pay for stockmen, which of course became the Gurindji matter and then became a land rights matter, and it was handed to the equal pay decision. You'll be interested to know that the advocate was Bob Hawke for some of that period, that it was handed down. But of course the employers, and in the spirit of how arbitration and conciliation has worked over the period of this of most of the half of the period of the colony, the employers said, no, we're not paying. So can you imagine now if a union made application for a pay increase or equal pay, and it got handed down, the decision was yes, and the employers just said, no, we're not paying. So when you hear about sit-down money, that's what sit-down money is. When you hear the Northern Territory ministers or Jacinta Price say everyone doesn't work up there, that's what transpired. Those stockmen and women up there wanted to be paid the same as a white person. The trade union movement made an application for that to happen. The decision got handed down. It was to be phased in 1968, and the employers said, no, we're not paying, and sacked everyone. That's how sit-down money happened. So you won't be surprised to know that I thought it was important to ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about workplace experiences in all of those contexts, and that it would be important for us to be able to document with data the workplace experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The first thing I did at Jumbunna was to establish an Indigenous people and work research and practice hub. And the first thing we did with that hub was approach Diversity Council Australia, who it's now well established does do the best and most innovative industry-based employment research in the country, and said to them, we need a piece on blackfellas, and it needs to be Indigenous-led and overseen, and it needs to happen in Indigenous research methodologies. So, from Jumbunna Institute, there was myself leading it and Josh Gilbert, who's a Warramai man, DCA, non-Aboriginal people on the right-hand side, headed up by Dr Jane O'Leary, who, for my money, is the best diversity employment researcher in the country, and an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander expert panel. And we had really great people from across the employment landscape, from across the academy, and from both unions and employers. As a collaborationist, it's how I like to work. So utilising corporates, so Dr Dean Sanders from Deloitte, for example, Phil Silliphant was at Wes Farmers then, Sheena Watt, now Sheena Watt MLC in the Victorian Parliament, was at AFL Job Ready, Lonnie Blanco, who's a very senior Aboriginal HR practitioner, Cara Keys, who was then at the ACTU, and of course our sponsors, and again very important to get industry buy-in, our sponsors were National Australia Bank and Coles, and they were represented on the expert panel as well. I'd like to acknowledge Lachlan McDaniel, who organised, who's a Wiradjuri man who was working with me at the time, who organised for us to use Gari Yala, that language, which is Speak the Truth in Wiradjuri. And our aspiration was to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers to share their workplace experiences, and so enable diversity and inclusion practice to be founded on Indigenous voices. We hope this report enables our mob to tell our own stories. Gari Yala, speak the truth. And of course, fundamentally, this is exactly what the voice was about, that our views are heard in a policy setting and application context. It's not rocket science at all, but it's something that clearly Australians aren't ready for us to have control over the policy settings in which we work. Our methodology was an online survey of 1,033 Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander workers. This came as a bit of a shock to a lot of non-Indigenous researchers, because it's always said that our people won't be researched. Well, if you were used as an anthropological subject for 230 years, you wouldn't want to be researched either. But we found that when our people are asked by Indigenous researchers, and someone that's trusted in community like the Jumbunna Institute, we had 1,033 people respond, which was absolutely wonderful. We paid a polling company for, I think, 188 who have a panel of 188, and the rest was community. Our ways, through our communities, through our relatives, through our families, through social media, hadn't gone to the dogs in 2020 as much as it was now, and so we were able to use the Indigenous network or the Black Grapevine to get it out. We asked, what are workers' experiences sharing their identity at work? How culturally safe are workplaces? What is the state of racism in workplaces? And what makes a difference? Because we wanted to tell employers what they could do. 72% of people said it's important to share my background at work, and 87% of people answered in the positively to the question, to what extent do you share your Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander background with other people in your current, and for all of these questions, it's your current or most recent workplace. So for most people, for 7 out of 10, it was really important that they shared identity at work, and 9 out of 10 did share identity at work and didn't try to keep it private. So sharing identity is important. But we also found that while sharing your identity at work is important for most mob, it's complicated and challenging, which every Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person in this room will understand. And of course, what's important to understand about this survey and the questions and it being formulated in Indigenous research methodologies by Indigenous people is, of course, we knew all this. This is the kind of stuff, I think white Australia doesn't necessarily understand that we are a parallel universe and we have our conversations in our community all the time and we know what we talk about. We know what work is like for us. So having an Indigenous panel meant that we could formulate the questions in our way. What we found was that sharing your Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander background at work is vitally important, but it's complicated. 2 particular reasons were given as to why sharing your identity at work can be so difficult. 63% of respondents experienced high identity strain, 39% experienced high cultural load. The best quote we had was, "It can be challenging as we all have different experiences growing up as blackfellas. Some are born on country with strong family kinship and cultural knowledge. Others were stolen from their black mothers by their white fathers and or government. Others waited till they turned 18 to change their surname and identify." Identity strain is a term the project team coined to capture a particular experience we kept hearing from respondents when reviewing the survey findings. It's the strain that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees experience managing their identity at work to avoid racism and bias. I don't know about anyone else, but I get a bit sick and tired of non-Indigenous people in the media pontificating about the identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The racism that is displayed in questioning people's looks and identity is the same racism that led to people going underground in the first place. Do you not understand that, white Australia? You drove us underground so we could go to school, so we could work, so we wouldn't have our children taken from us, and now you have a go at us for re-identifying. It's kind of wacky. It's captured beautifully in this quote. "If I share my heritage, then every error or mistake I make comes under scrutiny and I become attached to stereotypes. If I do well, then I am an exceptional Aboriginal who is out of the ordinary." Identity strain takes the form of having to work harder to prove that an Indigenous person can do the job. 65% said they experience this all the time, often or sometimes. Being asked to do something that makes you feel you are compromising your cultural integrity. 44% experience this. Being told to tone it down or be less outspoken about Indigenous issues. A third experience this, of course. The burden of cultural load. It wasn't just identity strain, and I've got to say this is getting better because we are talking about cultural load a lot now, and it's 3 years since this was released, and one of the reasons I'm here doing this tonight is that we're just about to sign off with NAB again to repeat it again next year. So Gari Yala 2 will happen next year, so I'll have a whole lot of other data to give you then. It wasn't just identity strain that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers had to navigate at work, but also the added burden of cultural load. 36% of respondents reported carrying a high cultural load at work. Cultural load refers to, and it's captured beautifully in this quote, "It's not our job to be the educators and make the workplace more inclusive. That just gives us more of a workload than anyone else and puts our jobs and careers at risk for not meeting normal work KPIs. Recognise and reward differently the load that we carry on behalf of everyone else." It takes many forms, such as I have to work harder to prove that an Indigenous person can do the job. I'm asked to do something that's made me feel I'm compromising my cultural integrity. I am told to tone it down or be less outspoken about Indigenous issues. Cultural safety means being able to practice your culture free of ridicule or condemnation. It occurs when a workplace acknowledges, respects, and accommodates difference. Captured really powerfully in some quotes that we got, and this to me was one of the most powerful. I have been embarrassed when going to the bathroom. A staff member stated I was going walkabout in front of everyone. This one isn't written down, it's an anecdotal one, but we did a project last year, or was it the beginning of this year, either one of them, in the New South Wales Public Service, and I don't think will it surprise you, won't it surprise you? I don't know. People who were level 10s, people that they worked with who were fellow level 10s would take their bags when they went out of the office, when they left the office, so the Aboriginal person wouldn't steal them. Managers and or media teams will often try to parade you on media in attempts to show that they are a diverse workplace without knowing or caring about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural needs or safety at work. I've had racial jokes made in front of me by clients, and a co-worker said to me, "Oh, so you're half-caste." I was the only Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person employed, so it made me feel isolated. How culturally safe are Australian workplaces? Lack of cultural safety takes the form of my workplace values the skills, perspectives and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are appointed in any internal roles with an Indigenous focus. I am comfortable expressing my cultural and personal beliefs at work. So, 1,033 blackfellas, that's the data. We'll do it again next year, which I'm really looking forward to. I wish in a way we had been able to do some pulse testing this year. I certainly copped it on social media and a lot of places wherever you went, even in what I would consider a safe place like UTS. I certainly copped, when I tell this story to a titter, and I was saying, all I wanted to do was eat my cupcake. It was the IWD do. And this woman who I thought was quite nice came up to me and said, how do you think the referendum's going? And the Indigenous leadership's just not united. It's such a problem. I was like, well, some of you vote Liberal and some of you vote Labor. What is so hard about understanding that Indigenous people are entitled to have a variance of views? I just don't get that one. But anyway, and my friend said, yeah, I was just trying to eat my sausage on a roll at the rugby and, this... And I said, I know. What don't people want us to eat cupcakes and sausage on a roll? Is that what it is? You can't even enjoy it. Anyway, so what is the state of workplace racism? One of the main drivers of lack of cultural safety was casual everyday racism at work. 59% indicated that they had experienced appearance racism at work in which they were questioned or challenged about how they look or should look as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. 56% experienced racist stereotypes at work, such as that illustrated in this quote. It was my manager in my most recent job that said, you people don't work, do you? And even in the referendum, we kept on, during that campaign, we kept on getting messages about jobs. And I understand that non-Aboriginal Australians that do care about whether people in remote communities work or not. What they don't know is that for the last 12 years, the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, and it was suspended for this purpose again, meant that the old community development employment programs were suspended by the Howard government, or was it by the Abbott government, And community development programs were put in place where people weren't paid and didn't receive superannuation, right? So they were paid welfare payments for this. So don't tell us now that you care so much about people in remote communities, because certainly you don't know, and you don't say any, you haven't said anything for the last goodness knows how many years. Now you've discovered through Jacinta Price that things are terrible, and she's the saviour of all our mob up there. 44% experienced racist slurs and jokes at work, again illustrated in this quote. In some work situations, there had been blatant racism, being called a mongrel breed, or you abos get everything for free. And my personal favourite, which of course is always in the employment scenario, well, how did you get this job? You only got this job because you're Aboriginal. So, what is the impact of workplace racism? We all know intuitively that being exposed to this sort of racism on a regular basis is going to erode away at well-being. But we wanted to quantify the impact so it couldn't be avoided. The light blue bar in these graphs are respondents who had not experienced racist treatment at work, while the dark blue bar in the graphs are respondents who had experienced racism. You can see that those who had experienced racism at work were 3 times less likely to be satisfied at work, 3 times less likely to recommend their workplace to other Indigenous people, and 2.5 times more likely to intend to leave their current employer in the current year. So, of course, it's bad news for employers. It's bad news for the economy. We've always known this. If you are a person who believes in employment participation, and like I do, I'm a labourist, then you understand that this is a real problem and it needs fixing. And we need our workplaces to be fixed. So, what makes a difference? What are we recommending? What are 5 workplace initiatives consistently linked to better Indigenous staff wellbeing and retention? 1, formal career development programs for Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander employees. 2, have a racism complaint procedure. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. 3, have Indigenous leader elder support or sponsorship of new and young staff. 4, deliver anti-discrimination compliance training at your workplace that refers to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. 5, celebrate days or weeks of significance. I'd have to say that I think that discussion's moved on a bit, because we did have public discussion about the racism in this place during the referendum period. So I think I'll certainly be campaigning next year about getting the Australian community to understand that racism at work is unlawful, because it is, and it has been for 45 years since the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act. And HR industry, I'm looking at you, because you clearly haven't done your job in getting people to understand that. What are 10 truths to centre Indigenous Australians' voices to create workplace inclusion? What can employers do? Now, these are tiny, so from at my end, so I'll read them out, but, good luck with that, Nareen. 1, commit to unearthing and acting on workplace truths, however uncomfortable this may be. 2, ensure any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander related work is Indigenous-led and informed. 3, develop organisational principles to make it clear how Indigenous community engagement and employment should work in practice. 4, focus on workplace readiness rather than worker readiness. So I've said for many years that Australian workplaces aren't necessarily good enough for our people, and our people are continually subject to racism in a place where they shouldn't, where they should feel just like they can go to work and be like everyone else. 5, recognise identity, strain and educate non-Indigenous staff about how to interact with their Indigenous colleagues in ways that reduce this. 6, recognise and remunerate. I said that right. I usually find it so hard. Recognise, I bet I can't do it a second time. Remunerate cultural load as part of an employee's workload. 7, consult with Indigenous staff on how to minimise cultural load while maintaining organisational activity. 8, focus on sustainable careers and career development rather than just short-term appointments. 9, take action to address workplace racism. 10, look to high impact initiatives, those that research shows are linked to better wellbeing and retention for Indigenous staff. So, in the 3 minutes that I have, we've got, that was where you can find out more information. You can dive deeper on the Diversity Council Australia website. Where to next? And then we'll go to questions. As I said, we're doing it again. Gari Yala 2 will happen next year, and we'll do it in the same way. We'll have an Indigenous expert panel that will guide both the formulation of the methodology and how it's done. I'll be campaigning around workplace racism next year with the First Nations Employment Alliance that we formed last year. That's a whole lot of community organisations and a couple of employers and the ACTU around workplace racism and around pay equity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because even within the gender pay equity scale, we don't have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander category or marker. We don't understand what that differential is, what's the difference between a white male and an Aboriginal female, which is the usual marker for the pay differential between genders and between races. We are way behind the UK, for example. I think I went there and met with the UK Human Rights Commission before COVID. And before COVID, under Theresa May, they had had a whole lot of work done around race and cultural and ethnic pay gaps, which, you know, of course, when I mention here, when it's raised, it'll be, well, what do they want now? And blah, blah. So it'll have to be, because, you know, blackfellas and other people can't ask for normal things in Australia. We can't have nice things. So that's where to next. I'd like to thank the museums for asking me. It's been a really great opportunity to talk about my work. It is my life's work. I'm very, very fortunate to work with MOB, and I get to work with Indigenous employment practitioners and Indigenous people and talk about work 24/7, and that might sound boring to most ordinary people, but I love it because I'm a loser. I love data and I love talking about employment. So over to questions. Thank you.
I think we'll just wait for the mics to turn on. So start thinking. I've got a lot of questions. I won't hog it. And can you just wait for the mic, because we are filming and
Sure.
recording this to, so people can actually hear what your questions are. Any questions? Yep, Jackie.
Thanks, Peter. Typical white settler colonial female question, making it all about us. Can you go back to your slides of the 10 points of things to do? First of all, thank you very much for sharing all that.
That's all right.
And I'm, as a person who works in an organisation who has a First Nations policy, and we're really trying to make it a much healthier work environment for everybody as a culturally safe space. I'm just curious what resources are out there, or is Jumbunna working on, as a business school, some kind of programs that maybe can help number 3 and number 5, plus all the others, but those 2 are the ones that resonate with me because, over the years, it's not always easy to see people struggling in those environments.
Yeah. I consult to a lot of organisations around that stuff, so I do that a lot and work on those 2 things and others with organisations. If your organisation is a member of Diversity Council Australia, you can get the whole report on there, and that's because they don't have enough money to give out their research to non-member organisations. It's not really expensive to join, and it's beneficial for every bit of diversity practice that you might be involved in, not just Indigenous. So you can find that on DCA's website, or I do lots of consulting work with organisations to tell them how to do this. Thank you.
Thanks, Nareen. Fantastic work.
Thank you.
I'm a mother to Aboriginal boys and an auntie to many Aboriginal teenage boys in particular. And you reflected earlier on the impact of an education system that's not necessarily safe for our kids. And frankly, that's still an issue. And I am kept awake at night worrying about safe environments that allow these kids to blossom not only at school but to make that transition to work.
Yeah.
What could you just reflect on the work that you're doing and give me some hope that our kids are going to be safe?
Sadly, I can't guarantee that, and I wish I could. I had one lad coming through and a daughter. And, you know, we all have those worries, as we just do. My kids are both white passing, so as I am, as some people in our family, others aren't, which is, for those people who don't have that experience, it's a pretty odd way to live when you've got siblings who aren't white passing and you're white passing, and you notice how different, you know how people are treated. So that's... my experience and my kids' experience isn't necessarily, I don't know what your kids look like, but, I don't know, their environment, so I can't judge. I would be, in advising my kids on where to work, I'm very careful. One of mine works in an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. That's a very progressive one, and one where I was happy to endorse that he works there. The other one works in what I'd consider should be a very safe environment as well, but I'd be really choosy. Because I just, it's because I talk about it all the time, but you mix with mob, you know what people say about work and the kind of stuff that gets said to people at work. And right now, they've all been emboldened, right? So they'll say whatever... they always say whatever they want because I can say what I like. But, it's going to be... It's ugly out there at the moment, I reckon. So I can't guarantee it. I would be choosy. I'd be choosy about my university that you send them to. UTS is great. And just like you are about school... like we all are about schools, if we can be, if we have the resources to, and I don't mean send them to a private school, I mean live somewhere where we can send them to a great public school. We have to pick and choose. So I'm sorry, shit answer, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this work. It's really, really important. I really appreciate it. I had a question about the inherent cultural load for Indigenous people working for government, particularly the state government, and what government agencies can do to help create safe workplaces for Indigenous people who have this undue burden.
I think it's really complex because a lot of the identified positions in the New South Wales public sector are in fact identified positions where cultural knowledge is drawn on, right? And that's how it should be. And our old people fought for those positions, right? But then becomes the complexity of the cultural load piece where things are inherently unfair and what's up. So I think all I can say is, as Peter talked about, this period where we're talking as a broad Australian community and we're thinking, and allies are thinking about how to go about our day-to-day, got to say to allies to step up, right? So, you know, for years we've said to people when they say, oh, what are the traditional owners? Google, right? Google, you've got a phone. So thoughtfulness and reflection, and we, you know, I don't want to open a complete can of worms, but, you know, we have some reflecting to do as well about, you know, what do we want? And I think safety and, you know, the kind of thing for parents where we aren't worried about sending our kids out to work. Thank you. I think it's almost time for...
No, I've got a couple of questions. Got a couple of questions. Quick. And just adding on that, you know, and this is a bit of a pitch, and I'll just test this. I've had in my mind a program or an exhibition. You know, we've the last couple of months we've heard it time and time again just on that. If you don't know,
ask.
Find out.
Find out. Google.
Yeah, don't rely on Black Google.
No. Black Google, right?
So,
Black Google.
Yeah.
We are so using that. Yeah.
But I guess one of the questions, and I'll do it. You mentioned, you know, the affirmative action and this dilemma that we are still in this deficit economy that we're trying to address and all of that. When do you think it'll, you know, start to evolve, you know, to actually recognising the true inherent value of us in this country, the way we are, because quite frankly, we've been around forever and we've existed pretty great in this country. We know what it's all about. And I think even in this, in terms of workforce development and that positive, those elements of the value of a thing called, you know, cognitive diversity and what that brings, that's widely accepted, but not for us.
No.
And, you know, on the other side, putting it out there, the benefits and the strengths of cultural intelligence and building that into, which we see diversity and even the New South Wales Public Service, you know, capability framework, diversity and inclusion, but no one understands in the concept of like cultural intelligence. Does that have a place in this?
Sorry, I had to sit down because I've got fluid on my hip and I had a cortisone injection about, how long ago? A couple of months ago. I reckon it's wearing off, right? Just today and yesterday. Anyway, brother, I think the concepts of cultural intelligence and us and how we relate, and this is just like a little Nareen Young theory, and emotional intelligence are so intertwined and inherent because I think culturally our emotional intelligence is so developed and so sophisticated that we, our ability to apply that and use that in a cultural intelligence context, I wish people could draw on it, right? So, as you say, the deficit approach to our culture and to who we are, and because, you know, like, because of all the removal stuff in our family, we didn't grow up thinking that these were assets, right? And it's only till I've been older that I've realised that these are assets and that you know, that it's a thing that's applied to our mob. So, I think these conversations are really important. And I just tonight realised that this is really dated now, right? Because over the last 8 months or so, some of the conversations that we have been having as a broad community, not just our people, have, I mean, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of them that I had during that lead up to the referendum about this kind of stuff with non-Aboriginal people was so sophisticated, but then the stuff you were seeing on, I don't know if anyone, some of the stuff you saw on telly and on social media were just so awful and so lacking in sophistication. So I think it's really hard, but I think in the New South Wales public sector, there's a willingness to have more positive conversations, but I don't know. And it's really interesting because in the gender wages gap, for example, it's going to be 200 years before that gets closed, right, at the current rate. So when would we expect it to be? We haven't even identified what it is, for example, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the cultural intelligence gap, anyone's guess really, bros?
Any other questions? Because I've got 3 minutes. I've got one more.
Yeah, okay, come on then.
As a really easy one to sort of wrap it up. Fantastic work. And what we're not seeing is, all of these initiatives, but nothing gets measured.
Nothing gets measured.
You look at the closing the gap, priority reforms and that. We are so far behind. Why? Because there is no baseline data.
Yeah.
Playing catch up.
Yeah.
So we know, as you said, we know all of this.
Yeah.
We're out there looking out at that.
Yeah.
So very simple, what's needed, or what I like to call, so what are the apathy killers that organisations, because quite frankly, I've worked in the public service for 30 years and all I see is apathy, that people don't care or they don't care enough to address the issue.
Well, interestingly, I saw this week that the APS have implemented targets for senior executive and management and leadership positions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
Tied to their performance management?
Dunno. Didn't.
Imagine that, being sacked.
Right.
Oh, sorry, let go.
And to me,
ended
the only
contract.
way, and I've been a diversity employment practitioner for a long time, the only time the gender gap gets changed is targets related to performance, to KPIs, right? The only time. Never. Nobody ever promotes a woman because they think it's a good thing to do, right? Or nobody ever develops a woman. So we have to, I think, take the same approach. It'll be interesting to see if there is going to be performance measures on those targets. I'd like there to be. And so, I'd really like to start talking about it for New South Wales.
Thanks.
That's all right.
Look, we're coming on, going to wrap it up now, but before I open it up to thank Nareen for that sharing, and as I said, this is the importance of listening, understanding, but being actually part of the conversation. But before that, I'd just like to thank you and your family. Sorry business is really important. And for you guys to turn up. And this is the unfortunate thing, that this is our world.
And if I hadn't turned up, it would have been the slap black.
Yeah.
Right? So of course
So-
I had the pressure to come,
Yeah.
even though... Yeah.
So just, if we can actually thank the family and Nareen
Oh, thank you.
to actually showing it, and we, feel your sorry business. And the unfortunate thing is that that's what our mob carry with us every day, losing our old people, losing our young ones. And that's central to this, that no one sees, because we normally keep that. So thank you. But once more, this is about sharing, this is about understanding the importance of that. It's been a real honour to have you here and share that.
Yeah, and thank you so much, my brother. Thank you so much.
So a round of applause, please.
Thank you.